The Syphilis Enigma, Europe's 1495 Deadly Disease Outbreak. Timeline, Part 1. DNA Chapter 1. The Hidden Origins of the 1495 Syphilis Epidemic. When Christopher Columbus returned to Europe after his 1492 voyage, he carried stories of a new world, and, according to historical belief, an unfamiliar and devastating disease, syphilis. As Europe embraced the riches of discovery, it also faced a terrifying health crisis. The 1495 syphilis outbreak exploded across the continent, first among Spanish troops during the siege of Naples, then spreading rapidly to cities across Europe. But what if that narrative is flawed? What if the origin of syphilis in Europe predates Columbus? A team of archaeologists working in Hull, England, made a discovery that would challenge 500 years of medical history. Beneath a construction site planned for a modern courthouse, excavators uncovered the remains of a medieval friary, complete with over 240 skeletons. What they unearthed could rewrite everything we thought we knew about syphilis. Among the remains was one particularly well-preserved male skeleton, identified as 1216, dating from the mid-14th century. His bones showed unmistakable signs of advanced syphilitic infection, lesions in the skull, deformation of the leg bones, and telltale signs of caries sicca, a marker of venereal syphilis. The implications were explosive. If 1216 died around 1350, then syphilis existed in Europe long before Columbus's voyages. How did this disease, widely believed to have originated in the Americas, show up in a religious community in medieval England? What kind of life did skeleton 1216 live? And how did he contract a disease spread through sexual contact, despite being buried within the walls of a celibate monastic order? This is the beginning of a shocking historical investigation, one that forces us to question what we've been told about the syphilis outbreak of 1495, and to follow the clues buried deep in bones, history, and belief systems. Stay with us, because the syphilis enigma is just beginning to unravel. Bone Chapter 2, The Hull Dig, Skeletons that Spoke from the Grave. In the heart of Hull, England, a team of archaeologists from Humberfield Archaeology prepared for a routine excavation beneath what would become a new courthouse. But what they uncovered was anything but ordinary. Beneath layers of soil lay the crumbling foundations of a long-forgotten medieval friary, and more than 240 human skeletons untouched for centuries. One by one, the bodies were carefully lifted, catalogued, and analyzed. Most were clearly members of the monastic order, buried with the reverence expected of 14th-century friars. But then came a skeleton that defied expectation. He was male, around 30 when he died, and in unusually good condition. Marked as skeleton 1216, he quickly drew the attention of the team. His skull showed deep, round lesions. His leg bones were thickened and warped, and his jaw bore signs of necrosis, bone dying from within. Every indicator pointed toward a diagnosis long believed impossible in this time period: venereal syphilis. How could a friar, a man sworn to celibacy, die from a sexually transmitted disease? Radiocarbon dating placed his death around 1350, nearly 150 years before the 1495 syphilis outbreak that ravaged Europe. And the signs on his body weren't subtle. They were late-stage symptoms, suggesting he'd suffered for years. Even more shocking, he wasn't alone. Other skeletons from the Hull Dig showed early or partial signs of treponema disease. This raised a controversial but crucial question. Was syphilis already present in England before Columbus even set sail? Was the real origin of syphilis not in the Americas, but buried all along beneath the streets of medieval Europe? Archaeology had spoken, and the skeletons weren't just bones, they were witnesses to a forgotten epidemic. DNA Chapter 3. DNA, Bones, and the Columbian Theory Cracks. For centuries, the dominant theory was simple. Syphilis came from the New World. Spanish sailors brought it back from the Americas in the late 1490s, and it exploded across Europe like wildfire. The Columbian hypothesis was the accepted truth, until science started digging deeper. Enter ancient DNA analysis. Researchers from multiple universities began extracting genetic material from preserved bones suspected of treponema infection. It wasn't easy. The bacterium responsible, Treponema pallidum, is notoriously fragile, yet in a few rare cases they succeeded. And the results were startling. Some of the medieval European skeletons, including the ones from the Hull Friary and other digs across the UK and Germany, showed genetic traces of treponema disease. Long before Columbus ever set foot on a ship, but more intriguing still, the strains didn't match modern syphilis exactly. Some appeared closer to Yaz or Bajel, tropical cousins of syphilis that also leave marks on bones. Had syphilis evolved in Europe itself, mutating into its venereal form later, or had it been silently circulating, undiagnosed, mistaken for leprosy or other diseases for centuries? The neat narrative of syphilis as a foreign invader was fracturing. And this raised deeper questions, not just about disease, but about blame, colonialism, and the power of scientific myth. What if history had it wrong all along? Classical Building Chapter 4, A Convenient Blame, How Empire Framed the Disease. Why was it so easy to believe that syphilis came from the other? That it was a foreign infection, brought to Europe by sailors who mingled with savage peoples? Because that story fit perfectly into the imperial narrative. In the 16th century, Europe was expanding its empires, colonizing distant lands, and bringing back more than just gold and spices. Disease became another item on the list. When syphilis began ravaging cities, people needed a scapegoat, and who better to blame than the newly encountered native populations? Medical texts of the time painted syphilis as punishment, for lust, for sin, for contact with the uncivilized. It was moral panic cloaked as science. But here's the twist. This blame game wasn't just cultural, it was institutionalized. Western medicine enshrined the idea that syphilis had alien origins, reinforcing the idea of Europe as pure, clean, and disease-free, until outsiders corrupted it. It became a scientific myth, repeated in textbooks, lectures, and policy. Even as evidence began to suggest a pre-Columbian European presence of treponema disease, the myth endured. Because it served a purpose, it made colonization look like a sacrifice, not a conquest, and it absolved Europe of the biological destruction it spread elsewhere. Bone Chapter 5, Hidden in the Soil, Europe's Forgotten Epidemics. Could syphilis have been lurking in Europe long before Columbus set sail? Archaeologists digging in Hull unearthed something astonishing. Over 240 medieval skeletons beneath a former friary, many showing signs of a chronic disfiguring disease. The most damning, Skeleton 1216, a man in his 30s with unmistakable lesions consistent with tertiary syphilis. The kicker, he died 150 years before 1492. For centuries, history claimed syphilis came from the Americas, but here lay hard evidence in British soil, disrupting the accepted timeline. Dendrochronology dated the coffins to the 1340s to 1360s, while radiocarbon analysis confirmed that 1216 had lived and died decades before Columbus was even born. If this man had syphilis, it meant the disease was not imported, but already embedded in medieval European society. And he wasn't alone. Over 60% of adults in the friary showed bone signs of similar pathology. These weren't impoverished peasants. They were the religious and urban elite, buried close to the altar in sacred ground. This flips the narrative. What if syphilis didn't arrive from America, but had instead evolved independently in Europe, only misidentified or ignored until it exploded into public consciousness during the 1490s? As we move forward, we'll explore an unsettling question: did Europe choose to forget its own epidemic? Don't forget to subscribe, and soon the second part of this video.